This episode of Lex Out Loud is brought to you by the patrons of Starwalker Studios. Learn how you can support the show at lexstarwalker.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 28 of Lex Out Loud, Writing Science Fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. This is a podcast for writers, readers, and all lovers of speculative fiction. I'm writing my third novel and I'm taking you along for the journey. So today I'm going to be talking some more about brute force writing, which is my own little term that I coined for myself, which basically just refers to forcing yourself to write when you're not sure what to write. Coming from the perspective of someone who's writing a novel like myself, and maybe you're at the very beginning of the process and you're ready to start writing page one, and you're not sure where to start or where to go or anything like that, and as opposed to spending days or weeks or months spinning your wheels, going nowhere, trying to figure all that out. Instead, you just start writing anything that seems remotely, like it could be part of the book, and just get writing, get in motion. The whole, a body in motion wants to stay in motion. A body at rest wants to stay at rest. So a lot of times, if you have what people often call writer's block or just some kind of difficulty, a lot of times just getting going will get you where you need to be. So that's basically all it is. Or it could be, if you're not at the beginning, maybe you're a ways in and suddenly you're not sure what happens next or whatever. The brute force writing is just writing anything, even if it's terrible, just to get words down, just to get yourself moving forward. So I have been trying this with some success. This is kind of a new approach for me personally. And it's been very illuminating. And I've been sharing that journey with you in previous episodes. So today I want to talk about a type of brute force writing that I recently tried that worked really well for me. And I have heard other writers talk about this or something very similar, and it works for them too. So this could be a really good tool to add to your toolbox, and that is having conversations between characters. So there are a lot of ideas out there, if you go looking online, for ways to get yourself started writing. If you're stuck or you're not sure what to write, believe me, I know how that is. So if that's something that you're dealing with right now, there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of different methods and techniques put forward out there online that you can find and try. So one idea that I've heard numerous times, which I used a little bit in my last novel, is to imagine one of your characters in an interview and then write that interview. So it doesn't really matter who's interviewing the character. It could be a reporter for a TV station or someone writing their autobiography or whatever. It doesn't really matter. And you don't even, for this exercise, you don't even really need to define who the interviewer is or why they're doing the interview or any of that. None of that matters. Unless, of course, you end up using this in your book or your story, then you might want to. But for the sake of the exercise, it doesn't matter. Instead, what this is really about is just you as the writer, through this interviewer character, asking your character a bunch of questions. And then this is the important part. You then answer the questions in that character's voice. So those of us who play role-playing games, you'd be familiar with the phrase, answer the questions in character. So the point of this is to help you flesh out a character in your story, and also to help you find their voice. So this is especially useful with a point of view character where you're going to write the story, or at least part of the story, from the point of view of this specific character. You want that character to have their own voice, especially if you're going to have more than one point of view character in your story. you want the voices of those different characters to be distinct so that I, as a reader reading, I know whose point of view I'm in, even if you don't tell me, just by the way they speak, the way they think, things like that, because they have their own voice. So if you're writing some huge book and you've got 12 point of view characters, but they're all kind of the same, that's not ideal. You want every character to be unique. So it's better to have fewer points of view and have all of them have their own voices than to have a whole lot of points of view and they're not that distinct. I feel like you see a lot of this in epic fantasy these days, where books will just have lots and lots of point of view characters. I'm sure I'm super biased in this, but personally, I think a lot of that is because of Robert Jordan and The Wheel of Time. I think a lot of fantasy writers writing right now, like myself, grew up reading those books and they shaped us as writers. And Robert Jordan had loads and loads of point of view characters. So, you grow up reading that and you think, I want to do that. That's what a good fantasy is I got to have 12 or more points of view characters, which if you can do that and pull it off and do it really well, that can be good. But it's really difficult to pull that off really well and do it really well. And it's far more likely that you may miss the mark a little bit, and then all those points of view become much more of a liability than an asset. And that's the thing. Robert Jordan was a master at point of view and making every point of view have their own voice and be very distinct. So being in Perrin's head was a lot different than being in Matt's head, which was different than being in Rand's head, which was different than being in Egwene's head, or Nynaeve, or Elaine, or Aviendha, or any of the characters that had points of view in the book. They were all very different in the way that they saw the world, the way they described what they were seeing. And, you didn't need the writer to tell you whose head you were in. You could figure it out from context, because all of these characters were very distinct and very unique, and they each had their own voice. So personally, I would love to be able to do that. But as someone who read The Wheel of Time numerous times, I've read the whole series numerous times, I also know that it's very demanding on the reader. And the very first time I read that series, I wasn't such a fan of all the points of view. I had certain characters that I really liked, and the rest of them I was kind of ambivalent on, or there were even a couple that I didn't like. And at the time, I would have much rather had a book that just had points of view from those characters I really liked, and I could have done without all the other points of view. Now, my perspective changed once I'd finished the series and went back and reread it at least a few times since it's been completed. And in fact, I just recently finished rereading the whole thing again. And in this last reread, I enjoyed every single one of the points of view. But, part of that was probably because I'd already read the whole thing. So I already knew what happened. I wasn't so much in suspense. And, when you're following a specific character and then something happens and you're kind of in suspense to know what the next thing's going to be, and then you have to read through 200 pages of other points of view before you get back to that character, that can be pretty rough. Now, it's a different experience once you've read the whole thing and you're going through it again, because you don't have that suspense so much, because deep down you know what's going to happen because you already read it. So I always remember that. But for me, the biggest thing is this is only my third novel, and it would be incredibly arrogant and incorrect, ultimately, for me to think that I could pull off so many points of view as well as Robert Jordan does. And if I can't do it that well, then I'm not going to do it, because, I just told you how, as someone who loved the series and loved a lot of the characters, the first time through that series, some of it was a bit of a slog for me because I had to read all these points of view I didn't care about. And that was in the hands of a master, someone who's really good at writing point of view. Imagine how much worse it would be if he didn't have those skills. So I probably don't have those skills, at least not developed to that degree. So I'm not going to presume to and put my readers through that. So right now, for my first book, I'm really trying to do it all with one point of view. I am considering perhaps doing a few chapters from the point of view of the main antagonist, but I'm not sure about that. And one thing that I am not a fan of, which has, at least for a while, it was a fad. I don't know if it's still a fad, but this idea of just having a random point of view character for one scene, like the janitor sweeping the floor when something goes down, and you're going to tell this scene from the point of view of the janitor sweeping the floor, who is a character that we will never see again, who has no bearing whatsoever on the narrative, but just for some reason, the writer decides that this scene can only be told from the point of view of this janitor that nobody cares about. I personally kind of hate that, even when it's done well. Personally, I think that every point of view that you add to your book is demanding a lot of the reader. You're demanding the reader get to know this character and care about this character. And to do that just for a scene, for a throwaway character you're just going to use for a scene or even just a few scenes, I don't think what you gain is worth what you lose. Cost-benefit analysis doesn't hold up there for me personally. So that's kind of where I'm at with this antagonist is, on the one hand, I do think it would be kind of cool to have a few chapters from their point of view just to kind of show you where they're coming from and let you kind of see inside their mind. But on the other hand, I don't want to do that unless it's going to be a significant part of the story, because I don't like it when books just have some throwaway point of view character. And at least sometimes I think it's due to kind of laziness in the writing. It's like, did you really have to tell this scene from the point of view of this janitor that doesn't matter? Probably not. You probably could have actually told the scene from the point of view of one of your actual characters that was in the scene. What did we really gain by seeing it from the eyes of the janitor? So I think part of the problem with this is, I think sometimes we as writers, we watch too many movies. And we're trying to write our book like it's a movie, and something like that works in a movie where you just have this random janitor that sees something crazy happen and we see their reaction, because, that doesn't slow the pacing down in a movie. You can do that in a movie, and we don't need to spend a couple pages reading about this janitor's life so that we feel like we know them well enough to have a point of view or anything like that. You don't have to establish anything about this character. So you don't really lose any time. You don't waste any of the reader's time or the watcher's time doing that in a movie, but in a book, it's very different. So, I mean, I don't know why people do this, but that's my guess is they've seen this done in a movie and they think they can do it in a book, and it just doesn't work as well, in my opinion. So yeah, that's kind of why I'm on the fence about that. Is I don't, the only way I want to add points of view from my antagonist is if there's going to be, more than a few, and if it's gonna, if there's going to be good reason for it, and if it's going to serve the story, and also if it's absolutely necessary. If I can find other ways to show the reader the things I want them to know about this character, other than doing a point of view, that would be the more elegant way to do it, I think. So anyway, sorry about that huge tangent about multiple points of view characters. So what we're talking about is interviewing a character as a writing exercise, as a form of brute force writing. So this is something ideally you want to do with a point of view character. I mean, you could do it with other characters too, because they should also have their own voice, even though we're not going to be in their head. Anytime they're speaking, anytime we hear their dialogue, they should ideally have their own voice. So it can definitely help you with that as well with other characters. So you can do it with other characters. But where I've used this technique personally is with my point of view characters to really get a feel for what their voice is like and how I want to write them. And also just to learn things about them, because you're interviewing them. And the questions you ask in that interview can really be anything. They could be simple things like, where were you born? How old are you? What was your first job? Things like that. Or they could be more focused toward the story. How did you feel when this happened? Or how do you feel about this person? Or whatever really you want. But really the exercise, all it is you have this interviewer and you're writing dialogue. You write, the question that the interviewer asks, and then you write your character responding, and you just write the scene of your character being interviewed. And you just come up with whatever questions you can come up with that you want to ask the character, and then you write their answers in their own voice. So I think there are a lot of writing prompts or writing exercises out there that are kind of variations on this idea. I saw one recently from Gareth Powell, who's a sci-fi author that I read on Twitter. And his kind of spin on it was he said to start with a character saying something, anything, and then a second character responds to that with what? And then you just take the conversation from there. So it's the same idea. You're still having a conversation with two characters and you're writing that out in a kind of discovery writing kind of way. But his variation is, you just have character A just say whatever you want him to say, and then character B says what? And then you go from there. So I'll have a link he wrote a blog post on this. I'll have a link to that in the show notes at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. So as I mentioned in a previous episode, I took a little over a week off from the brute force writing to see if I could flesh out some ideas that I'd had. And then I'd get back to it. Well, I wanted to get back to it this week, but I still wasn't sure what to write. I'd fleshed out my ideas some, but right now I was really working on my main antagonist and also my AI character. I have a character who's the AI for the station itself. So I thought about these kinds of writing prompts, basically just having two characters have a conversation, see where it takes you. And I thought I'd give something like that a try because I did do this, trying to remember, with at least one character in my last novel. And in that one, I did the interview, like what I just told you about, where I had that character interviewed by someone. And I ended up learning a lot about the character, discovering a lot about the character, or coming up with a lot about the character, however you want to look at it, during that process. So I thought I'd try something like that with what I'm doing now. But any time you use something like this, you want to make it fit what you're doing as well as you can. Don't just do some random thing. So I thought about how I could apply this idea to what I'm doing and where I'm at. So I had these two characters that I did want to flesh out more, that will be two of the main characters in the story, probably the main characters of the story. And the first is my main protagonist character, my main point of view character, Tia. And then the second is this AI character for the cylinder that I just mentioned. Now, I've actually at this point already written quite a bit from Tia's point of view, but as I think I mentioned in the last episode, I recently went through everything I'd written up to that point and separated it out because I finally figured out my synopsis for the first book, and I finally figured out what exactly is going to be kind of the elevator pitch for the first book. What's the basic story for the first book? And so I'd figured that out and took what I'd written, knowing that a lot of what I'd written was actually going to be part of a prequel story that was not going to be in the first book. So once I had this synopsis and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the first book, I went through everything I'd written and separated out the prequel stuff from what was going to be in the first book. And it ended up being about 2/3 of what I had was prequel material. And then the other third was stuff I could actually use in this first book. And I talked about this before. It's kind of weird how this came out. But I was basically, I started out just writing, brute force writing. And what I first started writing ended up being stuff that would be in the prequel. And in that, I had my main point of view character, Tia. Well, somewhere in this process, I decided that the main character of the first book would actually be the granddaughter of the main character in the prequel. And so once I realized what was what, I realized that, 2/3 of what I'd written was actually about the grandmother character. And the third that I'd written that was going to be in the main book would actually be the granddaughter character. Now, to confuse things even a little more, I gave them both the same name for reasons that I think will make sense in the story. But most of the characterization I'd done of the character at that point, the character Tia, had been in the prequel material and really fit the idea that I had for the grandmother character, who is more of, she wasn't actually an astronaut, but she was more of a right stuff kind of character, very heroic, very like an astronaut in that way, just, the best of the best, Top Gun kind of stuff. So that's the character for the prequel, the character that's the grandmother. The younger Tia that's going to be in the first book is different from that. She's less heroic, less right stuff, more kind of everyday average person in those ways. So at this point, most of what I'd written was really for the grandmother character. And as far as the character aspects I'd come up with, it really fit that grandmother character. So I needed to flesh out the granddaughter character because this was going to be the actual main character of the first book, which is what I'm going to write now. That, all this stuff for the prequel that I've written has gone into the desk drawer, and maybe someday I will come back to that and actually write that story, the prequel, because I already have basically the synopsis for that. Like I basically know the arc of that story and the arc of the main character. It's just figuring out all the details and writing it out. So someday I'll probably do that. But right now I'm focused on the first book because that's where I should be focused right now. So I needed to develop this main character, Tia, the granddaughter, and make her her own person. So she wasn't just a carbon copy of the other Tia I'd already come up with. I also wanted to flesh out the AI for the station because for what I was planning, that was going to be a pretty major character in the book. So I thought that this would be a great way to do those two things at the same time. So instead of having an interview, I would just have a conversation between these two characters I wanted to flesh out. And then hopefully through that, I'd figure them out more, both of them, and maybe come up with a voice for each of them. So that's what I decided to do. I'm gonna write a scene or scenes where it's mainly just dialogue between Tia and this AI, and I'll see where that takes me. So I had two ideas for scenes here that I could do. The first idea was a scene where Tia first, quote, meets the AI. And the idea I had for this scene is that she's repairing one of the robots that the AI controls, and that they get to know each other and kind of hit it off, at least as much as a human and an AI can hit it off. And then the idea I had for the second scene was a scene where Tia learns of basically the situation of the first novel. She learns of this problem going on in the city, which I'm being intentionally vague here because I don't want to spoil my own book. And she starts working with the AI to solve these problems. So I had these two ideas for two scenes I could write. So as I sat down to write on this day, to brute force write, all the usual roadblocks appeared that always do when I go to write a scene like this where I don't already know exactly what's going to happen, which is usually in past books, that's how I usually operated. I was much more of a planner and an outliner, and I usually wouldn't write a scene until I already knew how it was going to go, how it was going to end, all that stuff, and then I would write it. So this is very new for me, trying to just sit down and just pull it out of my ass, so to speak, and just write a scene by the seat of my pants and not knowing at the beginning how I'm going to end it or where it's going to go necessarily. So what are the roadblocks that are suddenly there when I try to do this? Well, the first thing is names. I need names for these characters. I need to know what to call them. Even if they're just placeholder names, I need something. But something I've learned with myself is I have to be careful using placeholder stuff, because that's part of my philosophy in a first draft is I just want to get it done as quickly as possible before I lose enthusiasm for it. And also, I don't want to get bogged down with editing or trying to find the perfect word or making sure everything's punctuated correctly in a first draft. That's what the later drafts are for, to fix those kinds of things. So my philosophy is usually, I don't want to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out a character's name or the name of an organization or something like that. I'll just come up with something on the fly that I can just use for now. And then later when I'm revising, I can come up with something better. But the thing that I've learned is I have to be careful with that because, I sit there and write 30,000 words, for instance, with my main character named Tia, and now I'm kind of attached to that. And I'm far less likely to change her name, which I'm happy with. I actually spent time coming up with her name. So that's not the best example. But the point is if I do come up with a placeholder and then I keep that for long enough, I get kind of a little married to it. And so, yeah, that's something, it's kind of a balance, right? Like if I'm in the middle of writing, I don't want to derail myself for an hour trying to decide what to name a certain character. But on the other hand, I don't want to just pull a name out of my ass that's not very good. And then I end up using that name because I've just used it for so long now that I've grown attached to it. And especially with this story where it's more than just what's a name I like, I'll use that name, because I have a lot of different nationalities of characters and I want to reflect that through the names. So, for instance, all my characters I've come up with so far, the first thing I do is I decide what their nationality is, and then I use that to inform what their name will be. And I will literally go online and look up names. For instance, in the prequel story, I had a character who was Indian, and I'll readily admit I don't know thing one about Indian names. I mean, I've known some Indian people, but and I, of course, I know what their names are, but I don't know, are those common Indian names? Are those even Indian names? I have no idea. I'm completely ignorant on that. So I did research and I found websites that listed Indian names and use that to decide what the character's name would be. And, I'll do that with all the characters. So it's kind of this fine line to walk between, I don't want to derail myself and spend too much time trying to figure out a name or something else when I'm trying to write the first draft. But on the other hand, I do need to spend a little time, because if I just throw something dumb out there, I might start to like it just from frequency of use and familiarity. And then I end up, something dumb stays in the book because of that, if that makes sense. So names were were a thing that was the immediate roadblock. I had Tia's name, but what was the AI's name? What am I going to call the AI? Are there other characters in the scene? What are their names, if there are? I realized I might need names for the mayor and other city officials in the city. So I realized at this point, as I'm sitting down to actually try to write this thing, that there were a lot of little details about the situation that I hadn't figured out yet. I realized there are a lot of little details about the station AI, which is really a group of AIs that work in tandem, and how it works. That, there are a lot of these details that I hadn't figured out yet. But I also knew at the same time that I could spend all day coming up with those details and then have no words on the page when I was through. And also, I didn't really have good ideas yet. It was one thing if I was thinking about these details and I had ideas coming that I really liked. That was not the case. And that's why I don't have the details, right? Because I haven't had good ideas yet. So I decided to just kind of shelve that and just start writing and do as well as I could with what I had. And that's what I did. And it turned out I didn't really need a lot of, or even any of those details after all, because I ended up writing both of those scenes and I did fine. So I started out with the scene of Tia meeting the AI for the first time. And it's really just a conversation between the two of them, which is what I wanted kind of for this exercise we're talking about today. We're just writing a conversation between two characters. That's all it was. And I tried very much to keep it as dialogue focused as possible. I do have some beats in there and, things happening, because just a conversation by itself is kind of boring. So for instance, in this scene, Tia is fixing a robot. So as they're talking, as they're having this conversation, she's also fixing the robot. So occasionally I'll tell you, what she's doing with this robot she's fixing. But the real focus of the scene is the conversation. So, we just have these two characters having a conversation. And other than that, nothing really much happens, except, through the course of the scene, Tia figures out what's wrong with this robot and fixes it. But other than that, it's just dialogue between the two characters. So after a bit, I got as far as I felt as I could go with that scene. I kind of got to the point where I wasn't sure what came next. And I think that's largely due to the fact that the scene was pretty much done. And I was at the point where I would now transition to the next scene, but I didn't know what the next scene was. So, you can't really write a transition to a scene when you don't know what the scene you're transitioning to is. So I kind of got to where I was kind of stuck. So at this point, I checked my word count, because again, my goal every day is 2,000 words. And I hadn't hit that yet. I don't remember what I was at, but it was less than 2,000 words. So I didn't want to stop. So I decided I'd start writing the second scene where Tia learns there's a problem with the cylinder and she starts working with this AI to figure out what's going on. Now, by this point, by the time I start writing the second scene, I'd started to get a real feel for these two new characters, Tia, the granddaughter, and the AI. So the conversation in the second scene flowed even better than the first one and was even easier to write because I already felt like I was getting to know these characters. So I was writing, banging away, and starting to wind down again. And I checked my word count, and I was at just over 2,800 words, which is well beyond my 2,000 goal. Which that's an interesting side note. I've noticed. There are harder writing days and easier writing days. And on the harder writing days, it seems like it's all I can do to get to 2,000 words. And on the easier writing days, I will pass 2,000 words by a fair margin, no problem. So that's kind of interesting. So yeah, this day I wrote 2,800 words, almost 3,000 words. So I was at 2,800 words and I was kind of starting to taper off. I still had some ideas of what to do in the scene, but I was getting to the near the end of what I had, and I was over my target. So I decided I'd call it a day and call it good. So all of this happened before I had come up with the plot synopsis for the first book, which I talked about last week, and I just kind of went over again a few minutes ago. And, like I said, I after this point, I looked at everything I'd written, and I divided it up between material for the prequel and material for the first book. And these two scenes that I'd just written with Tia and the AI are going into the first book. And what's really surprising to me was just here recently, I went back to read those scenes as I was doing this and deciding what goes where and all of that. And I read them over again. And actually, these two scenes that I wrote, these two conversations between Tia and the AI that I wrote as brute force with no idea what I was doing ahead of time, are my favorite that I've written so far for this project. They're the two best scenes I think I've written, and it's because the dialogue between these characters works so well, and you really get a sense of these two characters. So I feel like it was a home run. So I think there's a really important lesson here. I know I definitely learned something from this experience, and this is something I have seen before. Oftentimes when you're brute force writing, or you're just not sure about what you're writing or where you're going, at the time you feel like what you're writing isn't very good, like you won't use it, like you're going to cut this, in the revision because it's just not that great. Sometimes later, when you go back and you read that stuff that you wrote that you felt that way about, or that was really hard to write, you read it over later and you realize it's actually really good, or at the very least, it's a lot better than you thought it was. I don't know why that is, other than maybe we're just too hard on ourselves or too critical of what we're doing in the moment when we're creating. But I've seen that. I saw that with my last book, and I've seen it with this one more than once, where at the time I'm writing something, I feel like, oh, this is so uninspired. This is so just not good. I know I'm going to cut this. This scene is never going to be in the book because it's so bad. And then a couple weeks later, I read it and I'm like, actually, this is pretty good. It's definitely a lot better than I thought it was. So yeah, that's been my experience more than once. So I think the lesson from that, at least the lesson I've taken from that, is don't be too critical when you're writing the first draft. And even when it seems like it's going nowhere and you're just going to cut it, that may not be the case. It may end up actually being pretty good, or you can revise it later and make it really good. And just think, you may have never written that at all if you hadn't forced yourself to write that day. This conversation between Tia and the AI, is those two scenes are the best scenes I've written for this so far, in my opinion. And they only happened because I forced myself to write on a day when I didn't feel like writing. I didn't know what to write. And who knows, if I wouldn't have done that, maybe these scenes would have never happened. These two scenes that I wrote during this exercise are especially important because they establish the tone of the relationship between Tia and the AI. And that relationship is one of the most important, if not the most important relationship in the book. Right now, I'm thinking it's like a big part of the story of this first book is about the relationship between Tia and this AI. So it's really important that I get it right. I'm really happy with how this all came out, with the dialogue between the two of them, in the sense it gives us of these two characters. I let my wife read this, and she really liked it as well, for what that's worth. Of course, she's super biased, but oh well. So yeah, I think these two scenes were a home run, and they came about through brute force writing. And for all I know, if I hadn't have done that, I would have never written those scenes, or they would have been very different. So to me, that's just very encouraging to keep doing the brute force writing when it's needed, as I need to. I've learned a couple other things from this too. First, this brute force hack of just writing a conversation between two characters really works. I mean, it worked here. It worked in my last book. It's gold. It works. So if you're stuck, try it. It gets you writing and helps you flesh out those two characters and their voices. The second thing I learned is I'm learning that it's actually ideal, and I've heard other writers say this, for me, it's ideal if I stop writing for the day when I still have a little bit left. That really sets me up well for the next day, I found. You know, maybe I have an idea of what the next thing someone says in the conversation will be, or whatever. Or I have an idea of what the next thing in the scene is going to be that's happening. So what it does is it leaves me with a dangling thread that's unresolved in the scene. And my subconscious tends to pick at that thread until the next time I write. So over, the evening and the night and until I write the next day, I'm thinking about that thing that's going to happen next. So then the next day when I pick up the writing again, I have that dangling thread to jump off from. I already know pretty much what the first sentence is going to be that I write that day because I've already thought it up the night before or the morning before or whatever. So let's say I'm writing a conversation between two characters and the last thing I write today is character B says, "What?" I actually already know what character A is going to say in response, but I don't write it because I'm done for the day. But the next day when I pick up, my first sentence, I already know what it is because it's going to be what character A says after character B said, "What?" And chances are good, at least subconsciously, if not consciously, I have some ideas of what comes after that too. And if not, by the time I actually write out that sentence of what the character says in response to what, now I'm rolling, right? Now I'm going. Conversations have a flow to them, and so does good dialogue in a book. So I think it's really helpful to end your writing day in the middle of that kind of a flow where you already know what the next thing is going to be, or at least you have a really good idea, because it helps you get started the next day, as opposed to, I'm going to write for another 20 minutes and wrap up this scene or get to the end of what I've come up with. And at least for me, I found when I do that, then it's harder to get going the next day. And I don't necessarily come up with what comes next by the next day. But if I kind of end in the middle of a scene or in the middle of a conversation or before it's quite over, and I do know what comes next, then it kind of helps me hit the ground running the next day, if that makes sense. So while I'm thinking of this, here's another tip that I've learned from other writers to help you get going at the beginning of your writing day. I don't do this every day, but if I have a day where I'm having a hard time getting started, I tend to do this, and it does tend to help. So normally when writing a first draft, at least my philosophy is you don't want to be editing. You just want to be writing. So you don't want to be going back and fixing spelling errors and comma errors and stuff like that. You just want to keep going forward, keep writing the story. That's what revising is for. And that's normally my philosophy and how I approach it. However, on a day where I'm finding it hard to get going, I find it really helps to start out by reading what I wrote the day before. And while I'm doing that, I'll fix any little errors I see. If I see a comma or a spelling error or something like that, I'll go ahead and fix it while I'm reading it. But I find that the time I spend reading what I wrote the day before and maybe doing some minor editing, that kind of gets me a little more in the zone. And it also helps me kind of get back in that headspace I was in the day before. So, especially if I'm still in the same scene, but it even works if you're not. So I can kind of pick up where I left off and then start going again. So, yeah, I find it helps a lot and kind of brings to mind anything I was maybe thinking about while I was writing that the day before that maybe I forgot. And if nothing else, it just kind of gets me in the zone and gets me in the rhythm again. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that if you're, getting ready to write for the day and you're kind of having a hard time get going, go read over what you wrote the day before. And, you don't have to do any editing if you don't want to, just read it. And it might prepare you to then jump off writing once you've finished reading what you wrote the day before. So there we are, brute force writing. It's so funny when I first came up with that term and I use it on the show, I thought it would be something I said once and I keep coming back to it. Partly just, I really like the term. I feel like it really encapsulates what I'm actually doing, the brute force part of it, where, you're not trying to be fancy, not trying to be, whatever. We're just doing the work, right? Just getting it done, just chunking it out. And it's amazing, in a way, I think what it is partly is when you remove constraints, when you tell yourself, okay, my goal right now is to write 1,000 words and I don't care if it's any good. It's okay if it's horrible. All that I care about is when I'm done, I have 1,000 words on the page. That's all I care about. But at least for me, the experience has been that just the telling myself, I don't care how good it is. I don't care if it makes sense. I don't care if there are plot holes. I don't care about any of that. All I care about is putting words down, throwing paint at the wall. That's all I care about. That it I don't know, it frees my mind in a way from these imagined, I'm sure, constraints. And I actually will end up writing something that's good, or all those things that I'm saying I don't care about. It'll end up being those things just because I'm not worried about it. And I'm just giving myself permission to suck is really what it is. And somehow by just giving yourself permission to suck, it makes you actually suck less and have more fun doing it. I don't know. It's weird. But that's what I really like about writing. I've done other forms of creative things. I played trumpet, I play bass, I played a little guitar. And the thing I like about writing compared to other creative endeavors I've done is the first draft, second draft, third draft, the writing, revising cycle. I just love it because you can have the first draft is just pure creation. And as much as you can, you're shutting off your inner critic and your inner editor and your inner marketer and all these things. And you're really just focusing on, I have a story in my head and I'm trying to get it down on paper. And it's almost like you're watching a movie and you're writing out what's happening while the movie's playing. And your only goal is when the movie is over, you're still with it and you're keeping up and getting down as much as you can. That's like what the first draft is. And then your later drafts are going back through that and then adding the bits that you missed because it was going by too fast and you couldn't catch it. Or, there's descriptions you skipped because there just wasn't time because the movie was playing. Or, fixing your word choices, choosing better words, getting rid of adverbs, getting rid of very and like, and things like that. I just love that because it gives you this freedom in the first draft where you can just be creative and you don't have to worry about if it's good, if it makes sense, if anyone else would like it. You don't have to worry about any of that. And then later, once you finish that process, then you go back and you make it awesome and you make it perfect or as perfect as you can. Other forms of creativity are very different from that. I think about music, which is probably the other that I have the most experience with. And I don't know. I mean, it might be different if you're writing music. I don't know. I haven't done a lot of writing of music, but as a performer, I mean, that's definitely not what it's like. You don't get to go back and fix things later. At least not unless you're recording an album, then you can. But if you're doing live performance, you can't. All right. Well, I hope that that's helpful to you, is helpful to you as it has been to me. If it is, let me know. I'd love to hear how it works out for you. If you'd like to email me, you can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker, and you can call my voicemail, 951-465-5391. Finally, feel free to join our community on Discord. Would love to meet you there and hang out with you there. And you can find out how to do that at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. All right. So I will be back soon with another episode. And until then, keep writing.